Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. For more than 30 years, Bineshi Albert has worked on environmental justice and Indigenous rights. She grew up in the climate justice movement and remembers her family organizing for community and Indigenous rights throughout her upbringing. Bineshi says today the majority of viable climate solutions have been crafted and defined by corporations, governments, and only a few scientists. She's calling for a full-throated change in leadership, one that centers on the wisdom and solutions of those communities most impacted by the climate crisis. Bineshi Albert, welcome to Feminism Today.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So much to unpack. There's so many layers of issues. I've been looking forward to this interview for so many weeks now. So I'm glad our schedules finally aligned. And thank you for making time for us, really. Now, you've said elsewhere, climate action needs new frontline leadership. I think that's an important point of departure coming out of your movement and your work in the environmental movement, that we really want new frontline leadership. What do activists get right or wrong about the work that needs to be done on the ground?
So, when we talk about like frontline leadership, that leadership has been there. It's not necessarily new, but it's new to say, let them lead on deciding what the policies should be.
Mm-hmm.
Because we often, like you listed, we're listening to sort of politician, industry executives, sometimes scientists, but they're not really coming from the perspective of the harms that communities are feeling by way of the climate crisis right now.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those communities have been dealing with the crisis for decades,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're the experts in the harm. And
Mm-hmm.
so asking them to come up with the solutions and to have that space, that's a new perspective. The
Yeah,
leadership has been there for a long time.
right.
And they've been waiting and trying to get their voices heard. But
Mm-hmm.
they're also just moving on solutions.
Yeah. Can we dig our heels a little bit into this idea that capitalists can't really come up with the solutions? But more pointedly, to talk specifically about the negative externalities associated with economic activity and those who are bearing the brunt of it. Can we talk a little bit about how your organization proposed reframing the discourse and really reframing the policy solutions?
So, much of the policy orientation around climate change has been
Hmm.
reduced to a crisis of carbon, right?
Yeah.
And so there's been only a focus and exclusively on a focus of how do we reduce carbon.
Hmm.
But even in that, they're not saying how do we stop producing carbon. They're
Mm.
saying how do we reduce carbon once it's produced, and how do we mitigate that?
Mm.
And so that's a shift in thinking and perspective of, a lot of the frontline communities that we work with will all say the same thing: stop producing carbon at its source, right? With the fossil fuel extractive industries that are causing not only contributing to this climate crisis, but they're also polluting in the communities that folks live at, right?
Mhm.
The people's homes and their home communities, their neighborhoods, and are polluting there, and are pushing solutions that are saying, oh, but if we just plant enough trees or we invest in this, then we can keep polluting in these areas as long as we provide some offset somewhere else. And so we're trying to change that perspective about the climate crisis to not just be a climate of carbon, but a crisis of pollution and the industries who are causing that pollution. And then also like the solutions having to be about how do we reduce the harms that
Right.
communities are feeling.
I wonder if we could talk specifically, sort of giving viewers some insights into what the real problem is with carbon pricing and how that impacts sort of its reaches into indigenous communities. What's the relationship between this false idea of carbon pricing, as you've framed it, and what's really happening in communities across the country, really around the world?
So carbon market and carbon trading systems are systems that say um, carbon can continue to be produced at the levels that is now, as long as you have a way to offset that somewhere.
Hmm.
And corporations, and you see this all the time. Lots of businesses are saying, "Oh, we're carbon neutral or we're carbon zero, right?
What does that even mean?
It means that whatever they're producing by way of carbon from their business, they
Hmm.
have paid for an offset, either an investment in a forest or an investment in
Oh,
an agriculture area, or an investment in a technology that would erase that. They're paying for that, but they're still producing the
right.
original set of carbon. They're just offsetting that carbon existence in another space. And it's also kind of a shell game, right? Because it's like
Mm,
on paper. It's like, oh, we're reducing the carbon on paper. The effectiveness of some of those technologies has not all the way been proven yet. And
mm,
it's also safe to say that we're producing at levels that far outweigh what we can mitigate, right? So even stopping production, we will have decades of undoing what has been done, and maybe even longer. I mean, we didn't get to this situation overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight either. But we also are not going to get out of it if we're taking half measures or sort of these measures that are just on paper.
right. Now you're getting ready to travel to Egypt each year. A country representing a different region of the world takes over the presidency of the Conference of the Parties. Egypt was selected for 2022, and they will host the UN Climate Change Conference in November, in a couple of weeks, in a week or so. What are some of the goals you'd like to see realized at this meeting?
So, there's three set of goals that we're leading with. And one we've always had, which is no to false solutions and no to net zero, right? Net zero not being real zero carbon, but like how we're that shell game that happens with trading and offsets, but also solutions that come from communities are the solutions that we want to see. The second is around climate reparations.
Hmm.
Um, the conference of the parties this year is there's a lot of focus on loss and damage, and what does that mean to communities, and how do you repair and rebuild from crises that are caused because of climate and where things are at right now and the crisis that we're in.
Yeah.
And where does that live and exist, and how do we have mechanisms that actually go directly to communities and not through big banking systems or
Yeah.
other big financing schemes that doesn't necessarily actually go to addressing the harms that communities are experiencing. And then the final is about human rights and indigenous rights and indigenous sovereignty. And there's a lot of focus on like the different countries that have hosted COP and what does it look like. And this one is, it's been stressful in planning to be there, and what does it mean to like share some of the thoughts that we're trying to share,
Mhm.
and being in a place where there's people are bringing up legit sort of um, human rights concerns, and that impacts all of us,
Yeah.
everybody who's going to be there, and what does that look like. But also climate change in and of itself, and the climate crisis we're in, is affecting people's human rights, right?
Hmm.
the
How
right
so?
the right to exist and be where you are. There's
Mm.
the climate crisis is causing lots of other things that people don't always associate with climate, right? So extreme weather,
Okay.
loss of land because of sea level rise. There are communities who are having to move and relocate because of sea level rise. There are
Mhm.
communities who are having to move and relocate or even prepare for other more increased storms with hurricanes and such, wildfires, and the displacement that causes, drought and the effects on food and food systems, and can that have a reciprocal effect on migration, and how people feeling
Oh,
like they have a way to subsist where they are and where they're
mhm.
at. These
Yeah.
are all connected to the climate crisis we're in. And so the human rights of being able to like live whole and healthy in your community, to live without pollution, should be a human right. To
Yeah.
live without having to be in a community where you're constantly exposed to pollution, should be a right that we are all afforded. And so the climate crisis also it has a human rights aspect to it, and there's lots of things besides also just saying we have a right to protect ourselves
Right.
from polluting industries.
Yeah. I mean, I also see obviously a show like this, we're focused on the impact on gendered identities and just women in particular, how we are impacted by climate change. And I wonder if you can speak to what you're going to be going towards in terms of the women in Egypt. There's been some concern in the press that maybe as the grass rights feminist movement takes hold in other parts of the region, concerns are increasing about women's rights even further in the context of this, with the light shining on Egypt. What are you expecting to see? Are you concerned about the rights of women in that particular space? How does your organization advocate for women's rights in these types of uh, experiences?
So, I've never been to the continent of Africa. I've never been to
Yeah,
Egypt. I know it's a beautiful country and there's beautiful people there. And,
yeah, yeah.
so I don't want to make
Okay.
a sort of negative place to be. And yet, we know that governments all across the world, in this country included,
Yeah, yeah.
push very hard against the rights of women and the rights of
Mm,
women to exist. I live in
yeah.
a very conservative red state, and the attacks on the autonomy I have over my
Mm,
is
yeah,
built into the legal system that I live in
yeah,
here
yeah,
in the US and here in the state that I live in. And so going into a country like that, it's to think about how do we hold and connect those struggles and intersect that fight with the work around environment and how it impacts women in different ways. Like it
mhm,
is not very hard to connect the dots to um, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women,
mm,
location of some of these facilities and man camps, right? It's not very hard to make those connections and to realize that the harms and the harms that are happening to women across the world, and especially those women who are standing up for environment and who are
mm,
pushing back against, deforestation, and who are pushing back against, mining or drilling in their communities. In lots of other countries, they are under threat of violence and under threat of murder. And
mhm.
and that happens in lots of places. And so to be able to speak up and show support of the women in that community
Yeah, yeah,
is important, but it's also important to relate the stories that other people are holding of what it means to hold this work as a woman of color, as an Indigenous woman, as
yeah,
a woman, period, of
yeah, yeah,
speaking out against this, the business as usual, the sort of corporate extractive sort of business as usual. And what does that mean actually on our actual physical bodies and our physical selves?
yeah, yeah. I wonder if we could talk a little bit. You touched on it, and I was going to get to it a little bit earlier, but you beat me to it, which is great. But it's great and not so great because it's a very difficult subject. It's You touched on the boarding schools, but also um, the ongoing violence experienced and being experienced by the Indigenous community here in the United States, North America, Canada, United States, but really indeed around the world. Can you speak to there's certainly been an openness with the Biden administration, the appointment of Deb Haaland. Deb Haaland has been, you know, given funds to create a new unit to address some of these missing women, the issues around missing women. What do you expect to see out of the Biden administration? And what would you like to see in terms of realizing rights of the indelible, the dignified rights of Indigenous people here in the United States?
You know, it's hard to say what I would want of the administration on it. I mean,
Mhm.
I think that yes, there's a moment of the Biden administration also be an example. But like I shared before, and is that this is happening um, all across the world, in the global South in
Yeah,
particular, and in other countries where women are disappeared. And
Yeah.
if there's, especially if they're women who hold position or voice against, as a, extractive industries and the threat that is. I think for the Biden administration and the challenge before them is how do you do it, and then also like I think there's the investigations that they're doing and the
Yeah.
reports and the studying, but
Yeah.
once you find like, can you actually implement
Mm,
what needs to happen, and how do they have to then like address the systems and institutions that are facilitating that? And that's the hard part, I think, is the challenge in front of the administration is, if we're talking about an industry of a fossil fuel industry who is dependent on extraction from communities, including extraction of not only the labor and workforce, but of the physical bodies
mm,
in their communities.
yeah.
And so I think that's the challenge for the administration is you can bring attention to this, but are you actually going to do the work to dismantle those systems or to regulate or, do the interventions that need to happen with those systems? Because those systems are also built on that foundation. I mean,
Yeah.
we have a history of this country of, and the sort of colonization of this hemisphere brought this idea of dominion over land,
Yeah.
right? And this concept of like man over nature, dominion over land, that included dominion over woman as well. And so if you think about the earth and the earth being mother earth, the harms that are happening to the earth are also physically happening to women in this same generation and have
Yeah.
happened for decades. And so that expendable nature of thinking that women are expendable in this still exists today. All these, centuries later, we're still
Yeah.
dealing with the idea that women's voices don't have the same weight as
Yeah.
men, and that's a shameful thing for not only our country but for that sort of world thought as well.
Yeah. The powerful several years ago, a book was published. I think it turned into a movie. It was The Hate You Give.
Mhm.
And for me, the book and the movie was not so much about the experience of this young woman in the school, but really it was emblematic of how oppressed peoples are experiencing the world, right? And so the reality is what you're giving is coming back, and the harm that we're doing to the earth is it's the harm that we're experiencing ourselves, right? And that just makes it really, it's just so overwhelming. I'm also thinking about the policy, Climate Justice Alliance's policy towards energy and food sovereignty, and wonder if we could talk a little bit about that. I don't know if how aware or how engaged your organization is with the Green New Deal. Is this an area that's at all of focus, or what are your thoughts on the Green New Deal, and what would you like to see happen around this particular policy proposal?
You know, I think the Green New Deal, when it first came out, we had concerns about it, and not for what it contained, but for who it didn't include
Mm,
initially, right? And so, again, coming back to sort of frontline community voices, and now folks are like engaged in that and thinking about like what are the opportunities there to think about investment into communities, investment into different types of strategies and diversity of strategies. Um, and a diversity of solutions. And so, yeah, we're involved with, some thinking about not only the Green New Deal, but a set of policies that is about climate change and addressing climate change. A recent Inflation Reduction Act was not something we supported.
why?
There was some things in there that were challenging for us to support. It passed, and so here we are now then thinking about like, all right, what does implementation look like? And what are the things, those areas that were most concerning to us? How do
Okay.
we follow what's happening with that? And the stuff that was in there that was hard fought for environmental justice communities, like, how do we make sure that actually gets implemented? And In terms of food sovereignty, there's so many ways that it connects with, climate justice, and why it's a no-brainer for us to sort of think about um, food sovereignty. There's, not only like people's security and access to food and to localize that food. I mean, a good portion of, metric tons of carbon is produced just in the transportation of food.
Yeah.
And in this country, we waste so much of that food, even once it's transported somewhere. There's a lot of food waste in this country. And so really thinking about, like, how do we change the systems and policies, and how do we, like, have more localized systems, and people having more localized access to food, and access to fresh food in their communities. There's a lot of communities that just don't have that access.
Hmm.
And or if they have access to fresh produce, it's really expensive and not affordable for them. So even just the right to whole, healthy foods
Yeah.
as a human right is an important thing. But its relationship to climate also, like, it's one of the solutions. There's this, trendy term out there called nature-based solutions, right? And it's,
Yeah.
again, it's a sort of idea about offsetting carbon. And in one hand, you think about all the local community farms, and we're like, hey, invest in the community farms. And people all the time are like, oh, that's too small of a project to have a significant impact. And yet sometimes those same institutions or agencies are also like, oh, let's invest in, agricultural offsets. But they want, like, big commercial scale kind of things. And it's like,
Yeah.
why not have thousands of small community gardens where people are growing food locally and not having to transport food, but they're also creating, you know, a, green ecosystem that helps, clean the air as well.
Yeah. 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 Can we talk a little bit about the Black Caucus and how your organization is working in what does partnership look like, and how I'm just curious about the strategy towards Black liberation, and how that is being received by government or maybe the communities.
I don't know if I could answer how it's being received by government. That's
Yeah.
for them to say. But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but we have a Black caucus within CJA because we have 89 member organizations, and many of those organizations come from Black communities,
Mm,
or they have Black leadership, or a significant portion of Black membership within their own member organizations. And so, it's important to be able to think about how climate affects Black people. And then that space also holds, like, how do we move and navigate in this work? And also, like, hold the ideas and vision and intention and focus of Black communities in that work as well. I
yeah.
mean, it's no surprise that the larger climate um, environment work is largely led by white organizations.
I was just going to bring that up.
I'm
I
like,
mean,
they're led by white organizations, and they
right.
don't always see the perspective of Black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities, and being able to, like, lift that up. But for us, it's both, like, how do we sort of move and navigate with each other, and hold each other accountable to other systems. Like, we're not trying to, like, exclusively address anti-Blackness,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we're also moving in a space of how do we create a pro-Black organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we have an organization that is not just about anti-Blackness, but an organization who's about pro-Blackness? And what does
Yeah.
that look like? And how do we lift up those voices? And how do we engage in, like, meaningful conversation and dialogue and learning and sharing that helps move the work forward?
Yeah.
And how do we carry, what are the perspectives of how climate affects Black communities?
Yeah.
Um, you know, we we saw a number of um, you know, uh, catastrophes in the last, few months. And here we are still years later, still trying to fix the water crisis in Detroit.
And
And
it's
why are we still waiting for that to be resolved? Because it's largely a Black city, and
yeah,
it's like, all right, well, that we'll get to that eventually, right? And
yeah,
and even the idea that communities are expendable, or that there's sacrifice zones. Those
mm,
sacrifice zones largely run along race and are largely Black and Indigenous communities. So
yeah,
we have to be able to be real about that, but also have a space where Black leaders can connect with each other and share that as well. And,
yeah, yeah,
and that's part of CJA, and it's also their own discussion to have
yeah.
as well.
I was really looking forward to this, and you sort of hit the nail on the head. The last COP meeting, and things are changing a little bit, where, as you described, you don't really see the voices of young people of color being upset about the environment, right? You see the Greta Thunbergs. And so that changed a little bit. And we saw that in Scotland. But I really am wondering if you could speak to who the frontline youths are in this fight for climate justice. Like I said, most of the images we see in the media does not necessarily capture the voice and the anger and the disappointments of young people who are disenfranchised because of environmental degradation. So, could you speak to your organization's coalition of frontline youths?
It's funny, the sort of Greta phenomenon. I know she's, a brilliant young woman,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and but for every one Greta, there's 100 young people of color who I
yeah,
know who are just as articulate, who are just as passionate, and who have been at it as long or longer than her.
yeah.
I mean, I started this work at 16, 17 years old,
Right, right.
and so it's like there's been plenty of young people who have been engaged in the environmental justice, climate justice work for a long time. And how do we both like create a space for young people to engage in that? And how do we
Mm,
also just respect young people as experts of what they're experiencing right now, and not as just a separate space, but as an integrated space?
yeah.
Well, and holding them as leaders. We have, a handful of young leaders are going on with us on this delegation to COP. We were also very intentional about Black leadership coming with us to COP, because
Right.
we're going to Egypt, and we're also like trying to like not just lift up frontline voices, but lift up the voices that are not often heard in these spaces. And so
Mm,
um but, I think young people have a different approach, and their thinking, about solutions is so much more dynamic than when I was, 16. And, there's also some challenges that they're experiencing that are much different than when I was 16.
sure.
And social media wasn't a thing,
I know.
back in the late '80s, like, that wasn't a thing.
I know that's right.
So the reach is different, and the opportunity is different, and they're facing a lot more sort of challenges, just economic challenges, or just, being able to like make a living,
For
and
real.
being able to just have your own place. Like, it's much different than,
Yeah,
20, 30 years ago.
yeah,
And so that experience that they bring along with, like, hey, this is the crisis that we're experiencing both in the environment with climate, and this is how we need to like see that resolve. Like, they're not talking about just for the future. They're like, hey, we need this to happen now because it's affecting me right now.
yeah, yeah. Bineshi Albert, climate justice organizer, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me here, and hope we have another chance to talk longer again.
I hope so too. And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.